year 235 AD, Rome's army was still the most powerful military force on Earth. Its navy controlled the entire Mediterranean. Its currency was accepted from Britain to Egypt. No power on the planet could challenge it directly. But that same year, something strange happened. The army itself, the very thing protecting the empire, killed its own emperor. That moment kicked off the longest, strangest collapse in history. Not a single dramatic blow, a slow-motion fall that lasted more than 240 years, so gradual that most people who lived through it died without ever feeling like they'd witnessed the fall of an empire. Here's the question we're answering today. How does an empire this massive collapse over the span of 2 centuries without most of its own people noticing? Severus Alexander was the last emperor of the Severan dynasty, which had ruled Rome since 193 AD. He took the throne at just 14 years old, making him the second youngest emperor in Roman history. In 235, his own troops assassinated him in a military mutiny. It was the first time the Roman army, the very institution meant to serve the state, had turned into a force that could simply remove an emperor it didn't like and install whoever it wanted instead. That single act opened the door to what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, or the military anarchy, a period that ran from 235 to 284, a full 49 years. During this time, more than 50 different men claimed or held the title of emperor, and most of them were killed within months, sometimes days, of taking power. Some ruled for only weeks before being assassinated by their own soldiers, the same soldiers who had crowned them in the first place. The empire itself effectively split into 3 competing states: the core Roman Empire, the breakaway Gallic Empire in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. For a brief period, there wasn't one Rome. There were 3, each claiming to be the legitimate one. The real problem wasn't just political, it was economic, and that's exactly what made this collapse so invisible while it was happening. Emperor Septimius Severus, who ruled shortly before the crisis began, wanted to keep his soldiers loyal, so he raised their pay significantly. To afford it, he started reducing the actual silver content in Roman coins. The coins still looked the same, they still felt the same in your hand, but their real value was quietly draining away year after year. That's exactly why this collapse went unnoticed for so long. People kept using the same currency, buying and selling, living their normal lives. But every year, that currency bought a little less. Combined with constant civil wars, this inflation broke down the vast internal trade network the empire had relied on since the time of Augustus. Merchants could no longer travel safely, and trading with a devalued currency became harder and harder. Entire regions of the empire began trading through barter again, abandoning coinage altogether in some areas, a level of economic regression that would have seemed unthinkable just a generation earlier. From 249 to 262 AD, a pandemic now known as the Plague of Cyprian swept across the empire. It caused mass death and further destabilized communities that were already under pressure from war and inflation. The result? An empire facing political, economic, and public health crises all at the same time, while from the outside, it still looked like Rome. Roughly the same borders, the same capital, the same army still fighting on the frontiers. The collapse was happening underneath the surface. In 284 AD, a new emperor named Diocletian took power and finally ended the chaos. He restructured the empire into a 4-ruler system called the Tetrarchy, 4 men sharing power across different regions because no single person could effectively manage an empire this large anymore. After him, Emperor Constantine continued the reforms. He's the one who moved the capital from Rome to the city of Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople in 330 AD. He's also the emperor who legalized Christianity across the empire after centuries of persecution. The result: the empire stabilized again for longer than a full generation. But that stability came from a completely new administrative system, not a return to Rome's original strength. The Rome of the Old Republic and early empire was already gone for good. There's another quieter shift happening underneath all of this, one that gets less attention than the emperors and the wars: the slow transformation of the Roman army itself. For centuries, Roman legions had been made up of Roman citizens. But by the 4th century, the empire increasingly relied on something called foederati, allied Germanic warriors who fought under their own commanders in exchange for land, payment, or simple permission to settle inside Roman territory.
At first, this looked like a smart solution. Rome's population had been hit hard by plague and decades of civil war, so bringing in outside fighters filled the gaps. Germanic officers rose through the ranks, some eventually commanding entire Roman armies. But over time, this arrangement quietly transferred real military power away from Rome itself and into the hands of men whose loyalty was personal, not institutional. Loyal to a paycheck or a treaty, not to the idea of Rome. That dependency became catastrophically clear in 378 AD, decades before the empire's official end. At the Battle of Adrianople, the Eastern Emperor Valens led a Roman army against the Visigoths, a group of Goths who had been allowed to settle inside the empire's borders as foederati after fleeing the Huns. Frustrated by years of mistreatment and broken promises from Roman officials, the Goths rose up. Valens, eager for a decisive victory and unwilling to wait for reinforcements from his nephew Gratian, attacked directly. The result was one of the worst defeats in Roman military history. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed, and Valens himself died on the battlefield. His body was never recovered. A Roman historian writing at the time said nothing this devastating had happened to Rome's army since the legendary disaster at Cannae nearly 600 years earlier. Adrianople proved, for the first time in centuries, that an army from outside Rome's borders could completely destroy a Roman army in open battle. It was a wound the Eastern Empire survived. The Western Empire would not be so fortunate in the long run. By the end of the 4th century, the empire had formally split into two halves after the death of Emperor Theodosius I in 395, an eastern half centered on Constantinople, and a western half whose capital had already moved to Ravenna, not Rome itself. In 410 AD, something happened to Rome that hadn't happened in more than 800 years. The Visigoths, now led by their king Alaric, the same Alaric who had once served as a Roman foederati commander, entered the city and sacked it for 3 days. Alaric had wanted land and an official place for his people within the Roman military. Emperor Honorius refused. The result was the sack of the city that, for centuries, had felt untouchable. This wasn't the end of the empire, but it was the first time the entire world watched Rome, the symbol that seemed permanent, actually get sacked. By the 5th century, real power in the Western Empire belonged to powerful generals, not the emperors themselves. Names like Stilicho, Aetius, Ricimer, and finally Orestes were the ones making and removing emperors as they pleased, while the imperial title itself became more ceremony than command. Many of these generals, notably Stilicho himself, had Germanic foederati origins, meaning the empire's defense, and eventually its very fate,
rested in the hands of men descended from the same peoples Rome had once fought as outsiders. At the same time, the empire lost North Africa, its main source of grain and tax revenue, to the Vandals. That dealt a crushing blow to what was left of the Western economy. Without reliable grain shipments, the city of Rome itself, along with other major urban centers, faced repeated food shortages even before any army reached their gates. In 475, the general Orestes installed his own teenage son, around 14 or 15 years old, as emperor under the name Romulus Augustulus. He was a figurehead with no real authority outside central Italy, and Constantinople never even recognized him as legitimate. The Germanic soldiers serving in the Roman army demanded land and pay. Orestes refused. The result was a mutiny led by a Germanic commander named Odoacer, who killed Orestes and seized control of Ravenna. On September 4, 476 AD, Odoacer forced the young emperor Romulus Augustulus to abdicate. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia back to the emperor in Constantinople and declared there would be no more emperors in the West. He named himself King of Italy, not emperor, king, a symbolic distinction that meant everything to the Roman mind. From this point, historians mark the Western Rome.
When this actually happened, most ordinary people in Italy simply kept living their lives. Roman taxation systems stayed in place. Roman law continued to be used. Latin remained the language of public life. The church carried forward Roman habits of record-keeping and education. Farmers still worked the same land. Markets still opened in the same towns. Odoacer himself, despite being the man who ended 13 centuries of Roman political tradition, kept much of the existing Roman administration running exactly as it had before, because it simply worked better than anything he could replace it with. The fall of the empire was, in many ways, a political and symbolic event more than a sudden break in daily life. No bell rang on September 4th, 476, announcing that Rome was over. The collapse had begun 241 years earlier, and it ended just as quietly. Not with an explosion, but with a slow erosion that almost nobody noticed while it was happening. From the assassination of one teenage emperor in 235 to the deposition of another teenage emperor in 476, 2¼ centuries of history, dozens of emperors, plagues, wars, a catastrophic defeat at Adrianople, a sack of the Eternal City itself, and a slow economic collapse that reshaped the ancient world forever. Here's the question worth sitting with. If we were living through a civilization's slow decline right now, would we even notice? Let me know what you think in the comments.